Today, the National Press Club, Minister for Climate Change and Energy Chris Bowen. In the 2 years since the 2022 election, Minister Bowen has begun trying to position Australia as a renewable energy superpower. Today, he'll be discussing Australia's energy choice in the critical decade. That's today at the National Press Club.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, where we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. As South East Australia has shivered through freezing weather in the last week or so, the question of the reliability and capacity of our energy system has taken on a fairly personal meaning to people who have heard warnings of the system breaking down under the strain. Thankfully, that hasn't happened yet. By all accounts, the next decade in our energy transition is the most crucial one, and there is lots of conflicting information about how well we are managing that transition. And that's before we get to the political contest about forms of energy. It's a debate we'll be conducting for some months in the lead up to the next election, and we've invited opposition spokesman Ted O'Brien to address the club at some point. But to speak to us today and be questioned on these issues, please welcome the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen.
As we acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, let's also acknowledge that the energy transition underway in our country can and will play a role in eradicating the gap of Indigenous disadvantage. First Nations people have had very little equity in traditional energy generation. And so far, only about 1% of renewable energy projects in Australia have First Nations equity in them. This compares to around 20% in Canada. So it doesn't have to be this way in Australia. Let me give you an example. The East Kimberley Clean Energy Project will see the construction of a 900 megawatt solar farm, the largest in Australia, and a 50,000 tonne hydrogen facility near Kununurra. This project is an entirely new way of ensuring First Nations involvement in large infrastructure projects, with the traditional owners of the land, the MG Corporation and the Balangara Aboriginal Corporation, joining, with the Kimberley Land Council and climate change investment firms as equal shareholders. But Indigenous participation should be the norm, not the exception. It should be standard operating procedure, not to be singled out at the National Press Club. So that's why we've made First Nations engagement one of the key merit criteria under our capacity investment scheme. And it's why our forthcoming First Nations Clean Energy Strategy will be a focus of the Energy and Climate Change Ministers' Council meeting this Friday, because the only way we will get it working is with our colleagues across the states and territories. I also want to acknowledge Senator Jenna McAllister, the Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy. There's none I'd rather have representing me and us in Senate estimates, or in leading important priorities for the government like energy efficiency and climate adaptation. Thank you for your work and thank you for your friendship. The title of my speech today is Australia's Energy Choice in the Critical Decade. It's a very deliberate title because this decade will be critical for our energy grid and for our economy and critical for the climate. In many ways, the course of this decade will be shaped by the choice the Australian people make in the next 12 months. Australians will have a choice between paying for Peter Dutton's uncosted, unexplained and undeliverable nuclear reactors, or continuing with the Albanese government's and the experts' plan to get on with the job of delivering more reliable, cheap renewables, bringing down emissions at the same time. That's why I want to talk about the importance of our reliable renewables journey, a reminder on the why, as well as an update on the how. I'll give you an honest assessment of the opportunities and challenges in this journey. And finally, I want to underline some of the fatal flaws and gaping missing pieces in the alternative that's being offered to the Australian people. And to pose some questions that our opponents really need to be answering urgently if they're to be taken seriously as an alternative in the upcoming election. Responsible energy policy matters, not just for our future, but for the reality today. Every home and business needs reliable, affordable power. But a decade of energy policy chaos means we are now paying the price for that inaction. It costs Australians because we have an energy sector that's vulnerable to international price spikes and ageing coal plants. We could have been generating the cheapest power available had there been deliberate, considered policy over the last decade. Instead, there were 22 different policies and none of them stuck. And we know that Australians are paying more as a result. The government has responded in the immediate with 2 rounds of energy bill relief, and we're working towards greater consumer protections with the states and territories as well. But ultimately, cheaper energy bills for homes and businesses rely on the delivery of reliable renewables, firmed by gas, storage and pumped hydro. Let's be clear, 2050 isn't the start date for action, it's the deadline for delivery. Some people say they're committed to net zero by 2050 as if saying it is enough. And they think they can delay action to the late 2030s or indeed to the 2040s. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the task before us and of the opportunities before our country. This is the case across the board, whether it comes to our grid, whether it comes to our economy or the climate. In relation to our grid, investment is vital now. We lost 4 gigawatts of dispatchable energy over the last decade, replaced by just 1 gigawatt. That means we don't have the luxury of delaying investment in new generation for another 15 or 20 years, while we wait for a new form of energy generation that Australia has never had. Far and away, the biggest threat to reliability in our grid is over-reliance on ageing coal-fired power stations. Over the last year, not a single day has passed, not a single day has passed in which there hasn't been an unplanned outage in one of our coal-fired power generators in eastern Australia. Not one. Here's the thing. Like all of us, these coal-fired power stations aren't getting any younger. Here's the other thing. They don't get more reliable as they age either. So when David Littleproud says we need to, and I quote, sweat the coal assets for longer, he's describing a recipe for reliability ruin. And meeting our future energy needs is not as simple as switching from one form of energy to another. As other sectors electrify, as they need to, we need not only to replace coal, but to generate much more power to meet demand across the economy into the future. Now, Australia is unique in our abundance of reliable renewable resources. Of course, every country has renewables, but we have the best. Our sun and our wind are there for us to harness and power our homes, industry and communities. But there remains an urgent need to modernise our energy system to ensure that the power is getting to where it's needed. Last month, the Australian Energy Market Operator released the Integrated System Plan. It showed we need $122 billion of investment in utility-scale generation, storage and firming and transmission to keep the lights on and businesses going. It's critical we keep this pipeline of investment flowing. When it comes to our economy, managing the biggest change since the Industrial Revolution is the key to prosperity. Report after report, analysis after analysis shows us that delayed climate action is much more expensive. Delay is expense. And of course, there's the opportunity costs. Missing the opportunity to seize our future as a renewable energy superpower. Missing the opportunity for a future made in Australia. Missing the opportunity to make our economy more complex, add more value to our critical minerals and rare earths. Over the last 2 decades, Australia has slipped 22 places in the Harvard Economic Complexity Index. We're now ranked 93rd, in between Uganda and Pakistan. Seizing the opportunities of a renewable manufacturing future is the key to unlocking a more productive, value-adding economy. And of course, it's the critical decade when it comes to emissions reduction. Not all tonnes of emissions avoided are equal. A tonne of emissions avoided in 2049 is of infinitesimal value compared to an ongoing tonne of emissions avoided in 2024. The emissions reductions from closing an average coal-fired power plant in 2025, rather than 2049, is the annual emissions of over 50 million cars, or 2/3 of the annual emissions of the United Kingdom. just from one power plant. So we need to act now. As the driest inhabited continent on the planet, Australia is particularly vulnerable to climate change. Many of us are already living through this reality. Our black summer bushfires shocked the world. Every year, more of us are sweltering through increasingly deadly heat waves. And some of us are too regularly watching the floodwaters creep higher, as others wait for the rains in more frequent, enduring droughts. Temperature records, whether they be monthly or annual, are tumbling with unnerving regularity. Delay is not an option. Because this is the critical decade, it also needs to be the decisive decade. It's not the time for a return to that policy uncertainty, for new, untested and untravelled policy paths. It's time to stay the course and finish the job. After 9 years of delay, denial and dysfunction, we have to work harder and faster. Not out of some ideological impulse, but because of the reality of our energy system, our economy and our climate. They all dictate that we must. Now, I understand, having travelled extensively through rural and regional Australia, having conducted countless public consultations and meetings, having met with people from all walks of life, with all perspectives, that this transformation is confronting for some. I've met with passionate renewable energy advocates in the regions who've demanded more action faster, demanded to host more renewables. I've met with people who are happy to see renewables, but want to see better consultation and better community benefits. And of course, I've heard from some who oppose the renewable rollout altogether. It's far from a majority in any place I've visited, far from a majority, but it is a contested space. So that's why we're setting expectations for effective and responsible community engagement by transmission companies to improve the outcomes for communities at the centre of our clean energy transformation. We've introduced reforms for earlier and better engagement with communities by transmission companies. And with the states and territories, we're implementing the recommendations of the Dyer Review into social licence and community engagement. Importantly, in all of this, we and I don't see the states and territories as obstacles to be bulldozed through, but as critical partners. And I have to tell you, that's a profound change from the situation we inherited. And the good news is we're making good progress on this journey. Last year, I delivered Australia's second annual climate change statement, an initiative we introduced in the Climate Change Act for annual transparency. It includes our national projections showing that Australia is within striking distance of reaching our 43% emissions reduction target by 2030 and on track to beat our 10-year carbon budget. These hard-earned gains have been made by efforts to massively boost renewable energy and our reforms to industrial emissions. These put a cap on pollution from our 219 biggest industrial emitters, requiring them to reduce emissions to meet net zero by 2050. That's delivering abatement equivalent to taking 2/3 of the cars off our roads to 2030. And talking of cars, we finally legislated the new vehicle efficiency standard, a reform that had been in the too hard basket for 20 years, well overdue, delivered by us. There are bumps and challenges, of course. While recognising there's more to do, and we can't take the foot off the policy accelerator, I'm pleased with where we're at. When it comes to powering Australia, nothing will beat our sun and our wind. Reliable renewables are the cheapest form of power, and we've got them in abundance. The Integrated System Plan confirmed that renewables in the national electricity market reached as high as 72% in 2023, with an average penetration just under 40%. In the last 12 months, more than 12.5 gigawatts of generation and storage projects were approved for grid connection. And for some context, that's enough to power 2.9 million homes, or all of the households in the greater metro regions of Sydney, Hobart, Adelaide and Canberra combined. Since we've been in government, we've seen a 25% increase in renewables in the grid, with record investment in batteries and storage. And of course, there's more solar on Australian homes and businesses than any other nation in the world. Last year, there were over 330,000 rooftop solar installations. In Australia now, there are more homes with solar panels than there are with swimming pools. But to get from around 30% renewable energy when we came to office to 82% by 2030 is a big task, deliberately so, deliberately big task in the context of the critical decade. That's why we are unlocking private investment to deliver more reliable renewables through our capacity investment scheme. This scheme encourages new investment in renewable energy as well as dispatchable capacity such as battery storage. I'll give you some examples about how well it's going. The joint pilot tender with New South Wales has now concluded. When the tender was announced, the government's plan was to contract 380 megawatts of dispatchable electricity. After receiving 3.3 gigawatts in bids of such high quality, we were able to increase the tender results to 1.1 gigawatt, from 380 megawatts to 1.1 gigawatt, all within the same envelope, delivering 6 battery and virtual power plant projects in New South Wales. The first 6 gigawatt auction across the national energy market is now well underway as well. We received 40 gigawatts worth of registrations for that 6 gigawatt auction. This would be enough to power 21.5 million homes, more than twice the number of households in the national energy market. This shows the pipeline of good quality projects is there and ready to invest with the right policy settings. And the right policy settings is exactly what we are providing. There are other examples I can give. Take transmission, a topical topic. Now, you might have heard certain politicians say that we have a policy of building 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines. It isn't true, never has been. We're supporting the building of 4,000 kilometres of transmission lines over the next decade, plus the upgrading of another 1,000 kilometres. Of the 4,000 kilometres actually required, 900 are complete or well under physical construction, while the others are at various stages of advanced planning and approval. Now, just over 2 years ago, I stood here and described the gale blowing away 9 years of climate denial, delay and dysfunction. And this remains true. Australia still has a federal government taking serious action on climate change. But unfortunately, we still have a coalition serving up energy policies that will only deliver more climate denial, delay and dysfunction. This is the choice for the Australian people over the next 12 months. Our plans, based on the expert work of the CSIRO through GenCost and AEMO's Integrated System Plan, or the alternative of an uncosted, unexplained and undeliverable nuclear plan for Australia. The opposition blithely, and I must say arrogantly, ignores the data and facts from experts about the time and cost to build a nuclear industry for Australia and presents, therefore, a false future. The party that once prided itself on economic rationality shrugs its shoulders in the face of economic analysis, arrogantly saying it knows better than the experts. The opposition's nuclear policy is a triumph of dogma over data. It's a front in the post-war culture war, in the post-truth populist culture war, not a serious plan for Australia. A plan which is less about the future jobs for Australians and more about keeping Peter Dutton in his job. The Coalition dress up their ideological anti-renewables obsession as a pro-nuclear position. But fundamentally, it all comes down to a desire to do absolutely nothing. To do nothing because, in fact, they don't think there's a need to act. If Peter Dutton believed this was the critical decade, he wouldn't serve up policies which only guarantee inaction. It's obvious this isn't a serious plan by the way they're going about it. All the opposition has actually released so far is 7 locations. That's it. The great fanfare, but their announcement raised more questions than it answered. Perhaps deliberately so, because the opposition knows the answers aren't very good. The 7 locations even fail the test, even before we get to more details. 5 of them are in states with nuclear prohibition, and 6 are on sites where the owners have said they don't want anything to do with nuclear power. And they just arrogantly say they'll force it through anyway. What a triumph for the Free Enterprise Party of states' rights. Mr Dutton hasn't been anywhere near the communities that he's decided will host nuclear facilities, and Mr O'Brien barely has. Last week, I spent time in Port Augusta, in Lithgow and Central Queensland, 3 of the 7 regions chosen for nuclear power by the opposition. And they are also, of course, central to our renewable future. In each place, I met with interested locals. Of course, there were different issues raised in each location, but there were also common themes and common issues at stake. These regions are getting on with it because the reality is they know that waiting until closer to 2050 is in no one's best interest. All these communities are part of what is a remarkable energy transition and are already seeing results. In Port Augusta, I toured the site of a new green cement facility and a proposed critical minerals processing facility on the site of the old coal-fired power station where Mr Dutton wants to build a nuclear plant. These developments will employ more people than used to be employed in the power station. With the South Australian Minister for Energy and Mining, Tom Koutsantonis, we signed the first renewable energy transformation agreement, lowering the remaining obstacles to the delivery of energy infrastructure and ensuring that we're working seamlessly across governments. Now, South Australia is the first state to sign, but other agreements are currently being finalised with all the other states and territories, except for Queensland. In Lithgow, I saw the Mount Piper coal-fired power station, one of our youngest, where they are also investing to make the power station as flexible as they can to support the renewable transition and planning on a big battery on the side of the coal mine as well. And in Gladstone and Rockhampton, which of course I visit regularly because they're so central to our transition, I visited one of the country's biggest energy users, the Bowen Island smelter, which I've been to many times. There, we're co-investing to ensure the smelter has a prosperous future in a decarbonising world. Now, all these investments and more like them are at risk because of the policy uncertainty caused by an ill-informed nuclear frolic. And the key message from these communities is one I hear often, and it was a common one. They need jobs and investment now. Not in 2035, not in 2037, now. Now, these communities had other very legitimate questions, like how much water will be used in these nuclear plants, and where will the water come from, and will it be at the expense of farmers? All fair questions, well asked. Of course, it's Mr O'Brien's place to answer those questions, not mine. But nuclear energy is a thirsty form of power. It requires significant amounts of water to cool its radioactive cores to avoid disaster. Many of Peter Dutton's proposed reactors are near prime agricultural land, places where water is already in high demand for farming. Given our dry continent, you'd like to think the National Party at least would have an answer for where the water is coming from and give assurances that it won't be taken from farmers. Now, of course, they haven't released the cost of their plan, nor the number of gigawatts they think will be generated. So the experts have made some estimates. The Smart Energy Council, drawing on recent experience in the United Kingdom and other analysis, has estimated that the cost of the opposition's nuclear plan could run to around $600 billion. That's not private investment. That's money from the Australian taxpayer, from all of us. They haven't announced how many reactors will be at each site, and they won't before the election. The capacity of the existing and retired coal plants at these 7 sites, however, suggests that nuclear power stations could generate perhaps 11 gigawatts of power. Now, 11 gigawatts is 4% of the capacity of our national energy grid will need by 2050, when all these plants are meant to be up and running. That's a lot of dollars for not many gigawatts. And Australians will pay those billions twice, once in their taxes and again in their bills. Some experts say bills will rise by $200 a year, others say it's more like $1,000. Again, only Mr Dutton knows for sure how much bills will rise, but he's refusing to tell us. And from the perspective of the energy system, the biggest problem of all is that in Australia, nuclear and renewables simply aren't compatible with each other. While the opposition purports to support an all-of-the-above energy mix, their ideological pursuit of nuclear reactors in 2 decades' time would wreck the renewables rollout today. We know that's the case for 3 reasons. First, some senior members of the coalition admit it. No less than the leader of the National Party has called for a pause on renewables and called for a cap on large-scale renewables. Second, even if that is not their explicit policy, and they are typically very divided on the question, it's the investment impact of their nuclear plan. Why would domestic or global investors try to compete with unlimited taxpayer subsidies for state-sponsored generation in nuclear? That investment chill wouldn't come when the first reactor was delivered in 2035 or 2037 on a very ambitious timeline, or more likely the 2040s. It would come as soon as the coalition was elected. And so Australia will be trading urgently needed renewable investment for the hope of more costly reactors in 2 decades' time. In the context I've outlined of ageing and unreliable coal-fired power stations, we can only imagine what that would do for affordability and reliability. And third, if nuclear reactors were ever delivered, they are not fit for purpose for our grid. Our grid is almost, as I said, 40% renewable today. Renewable energy is incredibly cheap because its fuel is free, because it's the sunshine and the wind. When the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, we have ample power flowing into the grid at zero marginal cost, which brings down the wholesale cost of power to zero and even delivers negative prices in parts of the day. The IEA recently reported that due to increased renewables, our national electricity market saw zero or negative prices for 19% of the third quarter of 2023. In South Australia, zero or negative prices now occur 25% of the time. A baseload nuclear power plant will need to keep generating even when there are ample renewables, losing money for every watt of energy generated. Baseload nuclear power plants simply don't stack up economically in a grid with very significant renewable penetration. Is the Coalition's policy to curtail the zero-cost renewable energy to make room for expensive energy when renewables drive down the wholesale prices to very low levels? Some Queensland LNP members have said that it is. Or is there a plan to bankroll these baseload plants to bid into the system at prices where they'll bleed money at taxpayer expense? Either one of these is a recipe for Australians to pay more. For these reasons, Australians could choose reliable renewables or risky reactors, but not both. I've said before, and I'll say again today, I'm not ideological about nuclear, but the simple reality is that we can't have both renewables and nuclear, and so we face a critical choice in this critical decade, and I choose renewables. Now, this is a serious issue with serious consequences for the Australian people, and it's past time for the opposition to provide serious answers and details. If they don't, the Australian people are entitled to conclude that they are not serious people when it comes to energy. So here's 3 questions for Mr Dutton and Mr O'Brien. First, what role would nuclear actually play in our energy system? How many reactors? How many gigawatts? And what share of the energy mix? What is the role of inflexible and expensive baseload generation, and how do you make it economically viable given the role of low and zero cost renewables? Second, how much is it going to cost to build and operate? How will that cost be passed on in taxes and bills? And third, what on earth is going to happen in the meantime? With coal-fired power ageing and renewable investment chilled, what would keep the lights on and what would see bills go down? And what would a coal and gas-based grid mean for emissions in the meantime? The Liberals falsely claim that the rest of the world is going down the nuclear road. This is a lie. The world adds more solar and wind every few weeks than it does nuclear all year. Or just take offshore wind, for example. Just offshore wind alone. This year, the world will add more than double the offshore wind capacity than it will nuclear. Solar and wind combined already generate significantly more power than nuclear around the world. In 2025, wind power alone will surpass nuclear in terms of generation, and this will be followed quickly by solar power alone surpassing nuclear energy in 2026. Nuclear power generation was reduced, not increased, but reduced by 1.7 gigawatts in 2023. Renewable energy increased around the world by a massive 507 gigawatts. The nuclear renaissance Peter Dutton claims is a chimera. In 2004, as Michael Liebrich has pointed out, the world installed 1 gigawatt of solar power a year. Now the world installs that much solar power every day. By the end of the year, it's forecast to be 2 gigawatts a day. It would be a particular travesty if Australia, with our natural and obvious advantages in renewable energy, bucked the trend and paused our renewable rollout while we engaged in a national policy frolic of unprecedented irresponsibility. So let's call this out for what it is. The same people who spent the last 20 years telling us that we didn't need to worry about climate change and didn't need to take action are now the same ones telling us they have the answer, and it's nuclear. This is no coincidence. It's a tactic to divert, delay and avoid action on climate. It's a ploy to keep coal running longer and at massive costs to reliability and emissions. It's a betrayal of those Australians who've suffered from bushfires, floods and cyclones in the critical decade for climate action. It's a climate culture war undercut by the facts of engineering and economics. The choice for affected communities will be stark. The choice for Australia is and will be stark. We can have a mature debate on renewable energy and the nuclear alternative by all means, but a mature debate requires facts, and the Liberals and Nationals have provided pitifully few so far. The government will be staying the course and making the case to the Australian people that we should stay the course as well. This will be a choice to be made at the next election. We're here with facts and the arguments. It's time for the alternative government to get serious with the same. The Australian people deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Minister. There's obviously going to be an energy debate in the lead up to the next election, but of course the other issue that's just absolutely front of mind for everybody is cost of living.
Yep.
One of the ideas that's been floated by the Coalition in relation to its nuclear policy is the idea that people living in the region of a nuclear plant might get free electricity or subsidised electricity. But I was wondering whether another issue that's going to be a matter of contest is the question of providing support for electrification of houses and or for batteries, whether that's the next obvious step, given, as you say, there's a lot of solar panels out there. How do you see that household sector and marrying those two issues together of cost of living and energy working?
Certainly, Laura. Yes, in terms of cost of living, absolutely. That has to be the priority. But it's not a priority if you're saying we might give you cheaper power prices in 2040 when a nuclear power plant comes on. That is not a sensible response or reaction. But in relation to today, I'd say a few things. Firstly, the budget before last contained a very significant household support package, $1 billion to the CEFC to help households with low interest loans, support for social housing in partnership with the states because social housing should not miss out on the opportunities, and Victoria's just in the last week or so announced the rollout of their program supported by us, 50-50 funding, and we have agreements with the other states as well to do that. Support for local government, $100 million to support the local government to decarbonise, etc. So that work is rolling out. Of course, there'll be always more to do, but that work is already starting and rolling out and is very important. Also, this Friday, I'll be taking to the state and territory ministers a consumer energy roadmap, which will provide a framework for all of us to work together on that very question. How do we empower households to take control of their resources, whether it be solar and batteries or electric vehicle charging, reverse charging, into the future and over the next few years? That's, I think, the next vital piece of reform to enable households to take control. We've made some progress. States are doing the work. New South Wales has introduced a battery rebate for household batteries. We're focusing on grid-scale batteries and community batteries. But when we came to office, 1 in 60 houses had a battery. Now it's 1 in 40. Long way to go, but progress is being made.
Andrew Tillett has a question.
Thanks, Laura. Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and also board member here at the Press Club. Under the Paris Agreement, Australia has to announce its 2035 emissions reduction target by February. The Prime Minister's declined to commit to doing that by that time in the last few weeks when he's been asked about it. Can I just clarify with you, will we announce our 2035 target by February as required?
Thank you, Andrew. I don't share your characterisation of what the Prime Minister's done. The Prime Minister has pointed out the alternative government can't even have a 2030 target, let alone 2035 target, so they have serious questions to answer. We'll abide by our Paris commitments, absolutely.
Thank you.
Rosie Lewis.
Mr Bowen, the Albanese government has been accused of giving mixed signals on gas. A couple of examples. It's meant to be a key energy source through to 2050 and beyond, but then it's not encouraged under the proposed green rating system, or it's excluded from the capacity investment scheme. So how important will gas be to a second-term Albanese government? Will you be encouraging public and or private investment in gas?
So, Rosie, again, I don't agree with the premise about mixed signals, but we are the sensible people, pragmatic people when it comes to gas. You've got the Liberals who had a gas-led recovery, which was a bin fire, gas bin fire. You've got the Greens who say gas has no role to play in the system going forward. I disagree with both of those, and the government disagrees with both of those extreme arguments, and they're equally unhelpful. Gas will play an important role in our system in three ways. Firstly, gas-fired peaking and firming of renewables, as I mentioned in my speech. And I think the ISP sums it up. They see gas capacity going up to 15 gigawatts by 2050, but total dispatch coming down because we need more support for renewables, but it'll dispatch less and less often as we build the renewables and the storage. And that's the key, because gas is zero emissions when it's not being used, when it's not turned on. And that's why gas-fired power is an important complement to renewables. Unlike coal and unlike nuclear, which are inflexible, gas is virtuous, it's flexible. As we're building the storage, as we're building the system, we're going to need gas in the system for that. It's also going to play a role to continue to heat the 5 million Australian homes that rely on it. And for industry, while we are developing green hydrogen, and we are at pace, it's not here yet, so for cement making, steel making, plastics making, they need gas. So that's the role of gas, I think, a pragmatic approach to gas. In relation to the capacity investment scheme, it's not included. But I say this, even if it was, it wouldn't win. It's included in the LTESA in New South Wales. The LTESA, sorry to nerd out on you for a moment, but the LTESA and the SIS are very similar policy mechanisms. The LTESA is New South Wales, SIS is the Commonwealth. Gas is allowed in the LTESA and not in the SIS. It doesn't win in the LTESA because it can't compete with renewables, because the economics of gas are very different. Gas is profitable when it's turned on. By definition, when you turn it on, it's very profitable, but it can't compete in terms of cost to build with renewables. Hence, the capacity investment scheme is not the right way to deal with gas.
What about encouraging gas? Is there a role for government to encourage investment?
Well, it depends what you mean by encouraging. I mean, it's not our role to bankroll it or finance it, but states have, in terms of signing renewable energy transformation agreements with me, we are agreeing that there needs to be a reliability framework under the rollout of renewables. States can develop that reliability framework in a way that suits their needs in particular circumstances, as is quite right, because their needs will be very different. But if you're asking me if we are interested in subsidising gas-fired power, no, it's not the role of the federal government.
Mike Foley.
Thanks, Minister Bowen, for your address. Of the 9 critical transmission projects that AEMO has identified in its ISP, only one's complete. Delays are running, they say, at an average of around 3 years. Community opposition is one significant factor in that. I'm just wondering, do you think the federal government should and could have a greater role in speeding the rollout of those transmission lines, and can you rule out compulsory acquisition of private property to help facilitate that process?
Well, our role is to, thanks Mike, our role is to support the states and the transmission companies in getting the rollout done. And we're doing that through Rewiring the Nation, $20 billion of funds with agreements with now almost every state, and that's underpinning important rollouts. Now, in terms of how the rollouts are going, yes, some, of course, they're infrastructure projects. Infrastructure projects face challenges and delays. But you mentioned property acquisition. Let me give you an update on HumeLink. For example, one of the important ones. It's very important for better connections of New South Wales and Victoria, and it effectively plugs in Snowy 2.0. Transgrid, on the latest figures I've seen, has reached agreement with 74% of the landholders. 74% of the people that we need agreement from to build it. That's not 100, but it's not 0. And it's good progress, and that's growing all the time. So it's really a partnership. I work with all the states and with the companies to get the job done. decisions about compulsory acquisition are not ones at the federal government level. Inevitably, you try very hard, the companies try very hard to get as much agreement as possible from landholders before that's even contemplated.
Are you concerned that your 82% deadline is at risk?
Well, I believe we'll meet it. And I've run through some of the progress. On transmission, as I said, 4,000 kilometres needed between now and 2030, 900 under construction or complete. I am far from complacent, but I'm relatively satisfied with where we're at. Yes, there are challenges. I've never denied that, but more progress than you might think by looking at public debates about it.
Poppy Johnson.
Thank you for your speech. A number of EVs were used to support the grid during an emergency in Victoria earlier this year, according to ANU research. What's your view on the potential of using EVs to manage load across the system? And would you consider measures to stop or delay charging during a grid emergency? I'm interested in what you think about those sort of options.
Well, I'm certainly very forward-leaning on the opportunities for vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, vehicle to grid, vehicle to X charging going forward. And indeed, here's the scoop. It's one of the elements in the Consumer Energy Roadmap I'm taking to state and territory ministers on Friday, because it is a resource that we need to harness and enable households to harness in their own best interests. I mentioned households taking control. If you've got an electric vehicle and you can decide not only when you're going to charge it, but you can decide when you're going to take the power in it to charge your home or charge the grid and get paid for that, that's empowering consumers. Now, there are certain things we need to deal with. Standards Australia needs to come up with appropriate standards. They're working on that. We have some regulatory processes to go through, the states and I. But I am hopeful and confident that states will agree with the Consumer Energy Roadmap and the importance of vehicle to grid charging and vehicle to home charging, because cars are batteries on wheels. In most cases, the capacity in your car will be greater than the battery in your home. It's just a more powerful battery to get you around. So we've got to try and harness that for the benefit of individuals and the benefit of the grid. If, theoretically, just go with me, if every car in Australia was electric, and we're a long way from that, but for the sake of the argument, that would be the equivalent in storage of 5 Snowy 2.0s. That's a lot of storage, which again we want to harness. So yes, I'm very forward-leaning on the opportunities for vehicle-to-grid charging. It's going to take us a little while to work it through. I'm not forward-leaning on restricting people from charging at times of their choosing. I would not be supportive of that.
Anthony Galloway.
Anthony Galloway from Capital Brief. Thanks for your speech. Just to go back to Rosie's question, can you kind of confirm how long into the future the government projects gas to be a critical form of power generation? And for example, is it 2050? Is it beyond 2050? And is there a risk that if those projections are off and you do need gas as that firming capacity basically in perpetuity, that it's not a debate about nuclear versus renewables, it's a debate about nuclear versus gas?
Well, I don't agree with the last point, because gas will play a role under our system, as I've said, outlined the role I see it playing. The opposition seems to think that they're going to have more gas earlier, but they haven't, as usual, got any policy detail about that. But to your question about what role gas will play, again, I'd refer you, Anthony, to the ISP, which I think lays it out. So they work on the basis that we will need 15 gigawatts of gas capacity in 2050, but that dispatch will fall from 10 terawatt hours a year to around 6 terawatt hours. And that's at 2050. So then, obviously, predictions beyond 2050 start to get more difficult, because we're just talking so much further away. But that shows you pretty clearly the direction of travel. But those 6 terawatt hours are still going to be important. I see it as like life insurance. You don't need it very often, but when you need it, you really need it. That's the underpinning role of gas in the system.
Melissa Code.
Hi Minister, thank you for your speech. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. I'd like to ask a question about the tenor of the discourse about climate and energy policy. You mentioned polarisation in your speech, and this week Home Affairs released a Strengthening Democracy Task Force report which highlighted what threat to democracy polarisation in particular caused. As a topic that seems to garner a lot of very heated views, I'd like to ask what you think politicians, elected representatives such as yourself, but also public servants as the experts informing the stewardship of this policy, can do to shepherd a more constructive conversation. I think many everyday Australians might listen to this debate and feel defeated or cynical about the tone it takes on.
It's a fair question, thank you. Firstly, the role of the department and the bureaucracy is obviously to advise the government on the day, which they do exceptionally well under the leadership of Secretary Fredericks, a first-class Department of State. I don't think it's the role of the bureaucracy or the department to, as a matter of course, participate in the public debate. There'll be the odd exception where something is appropriate for them to say, but by and large that is not their role. Different for people like the chair of the Climate Change Authority or the chief executive of AEMO, for example, to talk about the facts. I think that's where I more see that focus. But on polarisation, I think it's a symptom of a broader problem. Climate change is the pointy end of that problem, but it's a symptom. It's not just about climate change. So it's something about health policy and vaccination, for example. Increasingly, people's motives are being questioned. We can have a robust debate about the best policy response. I don't mind that. I can do it as with as much enthusiasm as the next guy. But increasingly in social media in particular, you see people's motives being undermined or impugned. And I think that's where you get into dangerous polarisation. For example, questioning, it happens all the time on social media, obviously I see it's often targeted at me. If you're pro-renewables, you're accused of being a traitor because they're somehow caught up in a conspiracy about China. Or you're accused of participating in the climate hoax, which is somehow a conspiracy by scientists to keep getting funding. I've got to say, that's also perpetrated by some members of Parliament. Senator Rennick's Twitter feed is a cacophony of conspiracy theories and attacks on people's motives, including our intelligence agencies, our health bureaucrats, our climate bureaucrats, the Bureau of Meteorology, and it's not okay. And someone's got to call it out. I'm calling it out. I welcome Mr Dutton calling it out. It's not okay to question the patriotism or the efficacy of our intelligence agencies, saying that COVID was a conspiracy by our intelligence agencies. A serving senator of the alternative government? Really? That's okay? And Mr Dutton does nothing about it. So that sort of polarisation happens in the community, and we can and say do more about that, and we all do, but it's also happening in Parliament House, and that's not okay.
Are you concerned that this sense of not pulling in the same direction for being solutions-focused might undermine other policies like, for example, Australia's Southeast Asia Economic Policy to 2040, which references the importance of renewable transitions as one of its pillars?
I think it is, as I said, part of a symptom of a broader problem. And yes, it can impact on other things. And that conspiracy theory rabbit hole develops from climate change to anti-vaxxing to foreign affairs quite easily. And as I said, there's too much of it allowed and perpetrated in Parliament House in my very strong view. And having climate denial and anti-vaxxing sentiment expressed regularly by a minority, but some Liberal Party serving members of Parliament in 2024 is not, in my view, okay without it being called out.
Ellen Ransley.
Thank you, Minister. Ellen Ransley from The Nightly. Obviously, clean energy investment is on the rise, but a new report out this week found the big four banks had loaned more than $61 billion since the Paris Agreement was signed to fossil fuel projects, $3.6 billion of that in 2023 alone. Do you think that undermines the renewables transition? You said it wasn't the government's role to bankroll or finance gas. Should there be more guardrails in place around private investment?
Look, I do think these are going to be matters for boards and chief executives to deal with and be accountable to their shareholders and their customers and explain what they're doing and why they're doing it and implications. We, under the Treasurer's leadership, are increasing the amount of transparency and reporting requirements on all companies, not just banks, but all companies, but including banks. I'm a fundamental believer in capitalism. I'm a believer in the boards being accountable to the shareholders for their actions. And that's the appropriate place for that argument to be had.
Nick Stewart.
Thank you, Minister. Everyone in South East Australia knows that we're shivering at the moment through a particular period of cold. What fewer people know is that the cold here is being caused by a heat wave over the pole, and that's pushing the cold weather out from Antarctica. Do you feel that there's a greater need for information to be disseminated so that we actually get a better idea of how climate change really is occurring so that people don't try to deny it?
Well, I think you make a reasonable point, Nicholas, that you see in, again, too often in political debate, but also in the community, climate change denial expressed as, oh, look how cold it is. Global heating is not actually real. And we all understand that climate change is about much more. Flooding is more common because the oceans are warmer and therefore evaporation is greater and therefore flooding is worse. That is the case, across the board with natural disasters. Bushfires, flooding, cyclones, all made worse. Not volcanoes or earthquakes, but they're the exception to the rule. So I do think it's a constant battle, but I will say that climate change denial is very much a minority view. It's, based on most analysis I read, 9 or 10% of the community. And the science of climate change is now as certain as the science that tobacco causes cancer. And if you're not convinced yet of that, I think I'm going to be unlikely to convince people if they're not convinced with all the evidence. But I think the bigger problem is this, Nicholas, than that. Full-on, open climate change denial is now less fashionable than it was 10 or 15 years ago in the public debate. You can't do it as easily. It used to be quite common. Now it's not so common. Andrew Bolt still does it, but most other people don't bother with it. What it has been replaced with is what I call all-too-hardism, or what Michael Mann, who's a very, very good author on climate policy and politics, calls climate inactivism. It's all too hard. Renewables, it's all too hard. Renewables, building the system, it's too hard. Not actually saying we don't need to do it, but just saying it's all too hard. That is more dangerous, I think, in the public debate than full-on, straight-out climate change denial, which you see less and less of.
If I could just ask, just going back to local communities and cost of living things, one of the things that, I suppose, an appeal in the way the coalitions approach these nuclear sites is that they see these as communities that are going to be losing their existing sort of economic base because coal-fired power is closing down. How vulnerable is the government in those locations or those electorates to the argument that there are going to be job losses given that your whole speech today is about this next decade, what can you do to sort of persuade voters in those areas that you've got something for them that the other side doesn't?
So, Laura, in my experience in coal communities, and I spend a lot of time there, it's a key part of my job, talking to coal-fired power workers, coal miners about the future. They understand better than anyone the world is changing. They understand how the world works, the world economy works and coal markets work. They know that job security won't be there forever. I have never had a coal-fired power station worker argue to me, not once, that that coal-fired power station should be replaced with another one. We should build another coal-fired power station here so that we keep getting jobs. They know that it's not feasible, not realistic, not going to happen, would be irresponsible. They care about the planet as much as the next parent. They want to know there's going to be jobs there for them and their kids, though, and quite right. And so that's why we talk about what's next, the jobs that are next. Some are renewable energy, some are renewable energy related. The best example I can give you is the Liddell Power Station. It's been fallow for 18 months or so. It will be replaced by a renewable energy hub owned by AGL. One of their tenants will be SunDrive. SunDrive, who have invented the most efficient solar panel in the world, had a key decision about whether to make in Australia or the United States, following the announcement of Future Made in Australia package and Solar Sunshot. As a direct result of that, they decided to make those solar panels in Australia at the Liddell Power Station site. They will employ more people. That one part of the new renewable energy manufacturing hub will employ more people than were ever employed at the Liddell Power Station. More in one place, and there's room for a lot more of that, and AGL's developing other plans. So that's all the result of forward-looking actions by AGL, to their credit, and government policy. And I'm focused on doing that on the other coal-fired power station sites as well. That's why we have the Net Zero Economy Agency, led now by Ian Ross, and that is their sole focus. The sole focus of the NZEA is the future for communities and workers from coal-fired power stations. Lots of people of goodwill, I'll be honest with you, have suggested to me other jobs for the NZEA. Oh, we should get the Net Zero Economy Agency to do this or do that or look at that. And they've all made suggestions in good faith, but I've rejected all of them because that would dilute the focus of the Net Zero Economy Agency from the job of ensuring jobs in the future for people and communities currently reliant on coal-fired power stations.
Andrew Tillett has another question.
Thanks again, Laura. A question more for you as the member for McMahon. We've seen a lot of coverage in the last few weeks about the Muslim community organising politically. Also out in your neck of the woods, Di Lee and one of the local mayors there of organising politically for to campaign at the next federal election as well. Can you give us a sense of how serious you and the Labor Party is taking these sort of threats from, I guess, community independence is what you might call them? And do you think, in particular in relation to the Middle East, is this going to push the government into a position of taking, I guess, a more pro-Palestinian approach?
I'll deal with the question on the latter, Andrew. We make our foreign policy choices and decisions based on the evidence and good policy, not on electoral politics. We don't do that. And it sometimes annoys me to see newspaper articles saying, oh, this MP has argued for this and here's the percentage of Muslim voters in their electorate. Like they must by definition have a view about Palestine that's driven by electoral purposes and not for good policy reasons. So no is the answer to this last part of your question. We will continue to make our foreign policy choices like we have, like the vote in the UN, which gave greater rights to Palestine. We'll continue to do that with thorough cabinet processes and a discussion of the policy merits. We won't be making decisions like moving the Israeli embassy in a by-election. That's not our style for political purposes. On Western Sydney, which is where your question is focused, we take nothing for granted, no vote for granted, no seat for granted. All of us work hard in our electorates and deliver. And I think delivery is the key. In my case, in McMahon, I'm proud to have delivered the urgent care clinic for Fairfield. It will be delivered this year, and the new campus of Western Sydney University in Fairfield, and many, many other things, which you can only really properly deliver in government. So that's the focus. Western Sydney is right to have the view that they've missed out on government resources over the last 10 years from both federal and state Liberal governments, and both levels of government are responding in this rapidly growing area of population growth with appropriate levels of resources, as we should. And we'll continue to do that. In relation to independence, and particularly in my seat, I actually work very closely with Frank Carbone, the Mayor. We work closely on delivering for our area. He's not a member of the Labor Party, he's an independent. We work closely together. I and he both expect that to continue for many years to come.
Thank you.
Rosie Lewis.
Just picking up on the idea of vehicle to grid and vehicle to home, can you explain how it might work in practice, how soon it could be trialled, if it is a trial, in Australia, and how do you ensure Australians that don't have EVs miss out? Do you have to make EVs cheaper, for example?
Well, I mean, I find, Rosie, in relation to the second part of the question, there's huge interest in EVs. A lot of people would like their next purchase to be an EV. Many are going through the path of hybrids on the way. Not quite sure about EVs yet in terms of range anxiety as we're building the charging, for reasons I understand. But I expect EV sales to continue to grow strongly because people want to do that. And of course, we have delivered support for EV sales through our electric vehicle tax cut and cutting the tariffs through to EV prices. And that's really driven the take-up of EVs from 2% when we came to office to much closer to 10% now. Long way to go, but not bad for 2 years. And I expect that trend to continue as well. In relation to EV charging, reverse charging, bidirectional charging, of course, as I said, I will be taking that to state and territory ministers on Friday, but I want to see progress on a sensible, practical timeline, which is ambitious. This is not a 5-year proposition. This is much closer to something we need to roll out over the next year or so. As I said, I want to be clear, there are some practical challenges we need to overcome, regulatory standards Australia and other things we need to work together on. But I think working together we can make good and real progress. And I want those opportunities to be available to more people. That's why I want more people to have the opportunity to buy an EV.
Mike Foley.
Minister, you mentioned the risks to investment in renewables should a coalition form government. You said that investment would dry up with the pursuit of nuclear energy. I'm just wondering now, because media are reporting, and I've certainly had major investors tell me that that's already occurring in the active sense that investment is now more at risk from them. They're reconsidering their plans to invest. So my question is, has the renewables rollout already been materially harmed due to the fact that there's no longer bipartisan support for the 2030 climate target?
So, Mark, I think the best answer to that is it has been raised with me as a concern by renewable energy investors, yes. I'm not aware of any particular decision that's been taken to say, well, we were going to invest here in renewable energy and now we're not. I'm not aware of any decision that's been taken on the basis of the uncertainty caused by nuclear power, but has it been raised with me as a concern by renewable investors? Have they paid attention and are they worried about it? Yes.
And do you think that you need to do anything more to combat the potential loss of the rivers of gold that are flying into renewables?
I think we need to win the next election and put that issue to bed, is what I think.
Well, on that note, please thank the Minister.
Thank you.